We would like to start as we've lost already 13 minutes of our event. My name is Gulnaz. I'm a senior human rights researcher at Geneva International Center for Justice. And today we are at the side event on exporting terrorism and sectarian discrimination. We have our honored speakers as well as our discutants. Let me to describe the event, the structure. We will have our speakers giving us presentations, and then we will have our discutants who would like to comment or maybe ask questions from the speakers. After each discutant, we will have an opportunity for the audience to ask questions after each discutant. I would like to request you to ask questions only, and if you have interventions to make, to leave it for the end of the meeting. At the same time, we will circulate a list of participants. We would like to kindly ask you to sign up for the list of participants. Now, speaking about exporting terrorism and sectarian discrimination, one might think it's uncombinable expressions. However, when we speak about terrorism, the first thing that comes to your mind, ISIS. How about other groups? Militia, for example, that is armed, supported, financed by some countries in the Middle East. Do we ask ourselves how legitimate they are, if their actions are legal, do they violate human rights, or perhaps they commit as hideous crimes as ISIS? So I would like to pass the floor to our first speaker, Mr. Taha Boumedra. He is a former human rights chief, UN Human Rights Chief of the UN mission in Baghdad in 2009 and 2012. And he was also advisor to the Secretary General, Special Representative for Iraq. He has a deep knowledge of the involvement of Iran in the creation of those militias in Iraq and its policy against other Arab countries, especially Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. Taha, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm going to address this subject, and I would like to start from the legal situation surrounding this issue of terrorism. And because we are talking about the region, I would like to focus on the Iranian constitution. So these are going to be just the Iranian laws that regulate this matter. And just to avoid any speculation or any sort of diversion from the topic of the expansion of terrorism in the region. So in my view, when we look at the situation in the Middle East, North Africa as well, the starting point of the rise of terrorism could be located at the Iranian constitution itself. But let's not sort of talk exclusively on this Iranian constitution. There is also one of the fundamental reasons for the rise of terrorism in the area is caused by the war of 2003 to topple all the war of regime change in Iraq. So speaking about the constitution of Iran, I would like you to refer to this constitution, particularly the preamble of the constitution actually in force. This preamble, it makes it an obligation of the state to actually not only protect the fundamentalist Islamic regime in Iran, but also it makes it an obligation to export this revolution. And by exporting the revolution, it means constitutionally as well, and again, I refer to the same preamble of the Constitution, which indicates that the tools for exporting the revolution are a sort of paramilitary organization and using what is known as the Quds Force. Quds Force is this tool for exporting the revolution, expanding the ideas of the Wali al-Faqih, or the supreme guide of the revolution. You are aware that during the war of 2003, but let me take you back even before that. During the war between Iraq and Iran, that war lasted 8 years, and it could have ended in 2 years, in 1982. But because of the idea of exporting terrorism and the regime change in Iraq and imposing the doctrine of Wali al-Faqih in Iraq, Khomeini refused any ceasefire after the liberation of Khomeini Shah, and he accepted continuing the war in order to create a regime change in Iraq. We know the consequences of that war, and we know that the innocent Iranian young people were used as a tool for opening the minefields, and they were even used without any weapons in their hands. They were just ordered to go and cross over to open those minefields. And then, of course, Khomeini failed badly in achieving regime change in Iraq. And came the war 2003 of the Western coalition led by the Americans. That war indeed has achieved everything Khomeini's regime aspired for. So Khomeini wanted to topple Saddam Hussein, he did. The war of 2003 did. Khomeini wanted to expand the revolution, it happened. And Bremer, the one who ran the country during and after the war, decided to hand over in June 2003, he handed over the power to a group of militia of all kind of sort, but basically sectarian militia. And basically this movement that were trained and armed by Iran, and actually during the war 1988, during this war, this militia fought side by side with the Iranian Khomeini's regime or Khomeini's army. So now Iraq fell in the hands of the so-called coalition, and indeed in the hands of Khomeini's regime, and they started enforcing the ideas of really splitting the nation on sectarian divide, and arming and training these militias. And I remember very well when I was in Baghdad as the chief of human rights, we used to look into the horrible crimes that took place. And unfortunately, we are in the UN building, I have to say it, that the UN never investigated any incidents of those terrorist attacks, and they always find it easy to attribute what happens in Iraq, attribute it to Al-Qaeda. the UN system, the UNAMI, did not have any means of investigating any incident. Yet, miraculously, reports come up and Al-Qaeda is blamed for whatever happened. And you all know that later on, Al-Qaeda was dropped off the list and all of a sudden it became ISIS or Daesh. I thought I had 15 minutes.
5 minutes.
Okay. Just to sum up, I will not sort of dwell on this, but I want to say that the Constitution put the legal framework for the intervention in the regional affairs. It started the first probably noticeable intervention based on the sectarian divide was in Lebanon. The Israeli attack against Lebanon created this vacuum of power in Lebanon, and straight away the Quds force moved into Lebanon and set up what is known today as Hezbollah and its militia. Now we are witnessing this atrocities taking place in Syria. We know who is behind the regime in place, who is holding, arming, training, supporting, and directly intervening. And that is, again, one of the provisions of the Iranian constitution. The situation of Yemen. The situation of Yemen is, again, one of the situations that have been actually ignited by the sectarian Sunni Shi'i divide. And the Houthis, obviously a group from the north of Yemen, managed to, within few days, just like Daesh in Mosul, the Houthis took over Sana'a in no time. And how come a little group of Houthis in the north of Yemen managed to topple a government in place with its army, with its equipment, with its allies, and took over not only Sana'a, but they went all the way down south and took over the whole strip of the Red Sea in no time. This is not possible without the intervention of the Iranian regime. Let me say, just because I know time is pressurized on us, let me just say one thing, is that I would like to reflect on the UN Charter. The UN Charter, Article 4.1, puts the conditions for the membership of the United Nations. One of the basic conditions to be a member of the United Nations is to be peace-loving. And I would like to ask you, is this constitution of Iran provides or permits peace-loving for a government, the kind of government we have in Iran? Two, you have to refrain from intervening in the internal affairs of other countries, member of the United Nations. Iran now, without any doubt, and they are themselves showing pride that they have taken Beirut, Damascus, Sana'a, all these things. Now Iran is claiming that they are part of their vision of an empire. So a country that interferes in the relations of its neighbors, a country that has put a constitution proving that it's not peace-loving country, should it remain in the United Nations? It is a question that we really need to think about it, because there are legal foundations to question the presence of those countries who refuse to accept international law, countries who actually defy the Charter of the United Nations, countries who are causing wars in the whole region. In my view, we should, as civil society, put pressure on our government that at least this issue should be debated at the United Nations. And Iran's presence in the United Nations should be questioned. Second, the recent lifting of the sanctions against Iran, again, we need to ask our government to review this lifting of the sanctions for a country that has proven to be a pariah in the region. I say this, and I thank you. I think.
Yes. Thank you so much. If you could just pass the button. Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. So basically, Tahar mentioned the constitution of Iran and its intervention into the affairs of the neighboring country and supporting militia, as well as questioning the UN Charter and the membership at the UN, and concluded nicely if the sanctions against Iran should not be lifted, we should be debating this issue. Before I pass the floor to the next speaker, I would just like to mention that we have a translation into Arabic and French for those who would like to hear in another language. Our next speaker is Mr. Sabah Al-Mukhtar. He is the president of the Arab Lawyers Association. He is a human rights defender, outspoken person against activities of the terrorist groups, especially rise of militia and associated grave human rights violations. He is very knowledgeable and multiple times analyzed the role of Iran in the creation and support of these groups and how this is used as a tool to interfere within the internal affairs of the neighboring countries in the Middle East. Sabah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon. The international law and domestic law imposes what's called state duties of the state toward its citizens. The human beings who live in countries are protected by both international law and domestic law. And there are a number of protections of human rights that the citizens of any country should have the freedom to live, they should have freedom from torture, they should have the right of liberty and security, they shouldn't be detained unlawfully, they should be treated equally before courts and tribunals, they should have the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, they should have opinions without interference, they should have the right to peaceful assembly and demonstrations, and many other issues. These are rights of people which is protected by the domestic law of all the countries, and it is also protected by the international law. The UN Charter itself is the instrument which deals with many of these issues, along with some other very fundamental international documents, such as the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. There is the International Bill of Human Rights. There is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. In each of these documents, the rights of the citizens are protected, and states have a responsibility to deliver that protection. On the EU level, the European Treaty, it obliges the European states in their dealings with other states to ensure that the states they deal with respect human rights. Now, in order to examine the situation of Iraq in particular, I would like to look at the one aspect of the abuse of the legislative process in Iraq. Everybody knows that Iraq was occupied in 2003. The US imposed a constitution on Iraq. It set up the process of government in Iraq. The whole thing was built on dividing the nation into Kurds, Shiites, and Sunnis. So it's a combination of ethno-sectarian structure. So on the one hand, we talk about ethnicity. On the other hand, we talk about sectarianism. This occupation, which created this constitution, had also put in place the presumption that there is a legislative power in Iraq, which is a parliament. Everybody thinks that this is the right thing to do. But when one looks at the process of parliamentary elections in Iraq and what the Iraqi parliament is, one will be absolutely surprised to see there is not a single person or a party that has a manifesto. So the Iraqis are asked to vote about something which they don't know. Many of the people don't even know the people they are voting for. There are, during the election time, you have great big posters which has a picture of a man, but you are voting for his wife because the wife her picture shouldn't be shown. So it says, vote for whatever, the wife of Haji Muhammad or whatever other name. Now, this is the kind of election that was set up. In all elections, all the dictatorships in the Arab world, from Algeria all the way to the Gulf, they've always had elections. But elections are not democracy. Elections is a process. So the whole community, the international community, began to treat the election as democracy, and they said there is democracy in Iraq. The parliament in Iraq, all the members of parliament accuse each other of being corrupt, and they all accuse the ministers of being corrupt, and the ministers come to the parliament and accuse the MPs of being corrupt, and there are members of parliament, and I tell you this is the honest truth. A man comes on television and he says, I have taken bribes, and I have participated in illegal and parliament in Iraq, because I want to show you how the legislative process is being manipulated. And I will take only 3 quick examples. There is the example of the legislation which is criminalizing Al-Ba'ath Party. No matter what anybody thinks about Al-Ba'ath Party. Al-Ba'ath Party is not the equivalent of the Nazis in Germany. That is for the Westerners who do not probably think about it this way. Because everybody in Europe, the Europeans, think in terms of Nazism. And therefore, to them, Ba'athism is the equivalent of Nazism, which is just simply not true, and I will not go into any details. But it's fine. Governments can ban a political party. But this piece of legislation, it provides... Thank you very much. So the definition,
Gentlemen, please. Gentlemen. Gentlemen, please have a seat.
Yes, please.
Please, if you could then. Gentlemen, please leave the room.
I recognize them
Gentlemen, please leave the
by
room.
their faces. They were the Iranians.
Gentlemen. Gentlemen, please leave the room.
يلا طلع قول لك كافي طلع خلي يطلعوا نربح وقت نحكي اطلع يلا عباس ليش يدقوا؟ ليش لازم يدقوا؟
قرب الندوة.
اطلع
Gentlemen, please leave the room.
ماكو اسلوب هذا اي مو
اسود وجهه كفي وجهه كفي اسود وجهه كفي ام داكم تركم السعوديه بفلوسه ام داكم عيب عليك تبيع بلدك انا احلفوكم لا واحد ثاني سعود سواوي سعوديه وهابيه ارهابيين انا اقول لا ارهابيه ولد الكلب العظيم جاينا صباح المختار كل درجه انا على ابوك لا واحد ثاني
Ladies and gentlemen, we respect your right to express your opinion, but this is not the forum, and it is not today. We would like to continue with our speaker. Gentlemen, have a seat, please. If anyone would like to speak loud, please leave the room.
Speak in English because I don't understand Arabic.
Let them take this one out.
دوسمو بكفي دوسمو بعدين مرتزقه خوانه بعدين مرتزقه خوانه عويني انت اللي عنده عايز انت اللي عنده حي
Ladies and gentlemen, let us continue the meeting, please. Now we continue the meeting. Have a seat, please.
تسلم على جرائم داعش نتحول قضايا على العراق وتعتبر عمليات انتحاريه
Leave the room, please.
قاعده وتسيطر على القاعده انت تسيطر على داعش ايها الحقوقيين تسيطرون على داعش تسيطرون على داعش انتم هوني بالانتحاريين تسيطر على القاعده وتسيطر على داعش اخوانا دواعش.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We'll continue. I was trying.
الناطق الرسمي للحج الشعبي الناطق الرسمي للحج الشعبي الناطق الشيخ ريان الكنداني.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is an example of the behavior. This is an example of the behavior.
Gentlemen, please.
Sorry, I have the floor. Can you stop, please? I have the floor. Stop, please. So what I was saying, I was going to give you an example of what the law says. It's not an opinion. The law provides no definition of any of the word it used. It says, the title of the law says, banning the Ba'ath Party entities, parties, and activities that are discriminatory, terrorists, or takfiri. This is the title of the law. The law does not provide any definition for any of these words. The law further uses adjectives such as those that contradict principles of democracy are banned. Those that contradict principles of peaceful transition of power are banned. It prohibits all cultural, political, educational activities under any name. And it prohibits any person from making any positive statement about the thought, workings, or the past practices of the Ba'ath Party. That's Article 4. It prohibits demonstrations, sit-ins, or any public expression of views in that regard. It establishes a committee which is made up by senior officials, 2 judges, and a minister that decides who is banned, who is not. The law provides for sentences that does not exceed 10-year imprisonment. Just to make this one clear, if I am to write a book about the history of Iraq during the Ba'ath time, and I set out all the good things and all the bad things. So if I accuse the regime and the Ba'athists and Saddam Hussein of all the bad things, but at the same time say they were fine with education or health or culture or whatever it is, I could be sentenced for 10 years for saying that. The law is a subversive political instrument which does not allow people to do anything, and it is being used without definition to achieve political process. This was described by the UN High Commissioner as vengeance, not justice. Sorry, do forgive me. The US-led invasion in Iraq 2003 and the coalition issued legislations. Among them was the de-Ba'athifications. Based on that one, something like 100,000 families were disenfranchised. 100,000 families means something like 500,000 people. They were deprived of jobs, pension, or any other activities. The British Chilcot inquiry referred to this. It says that, among other things, it says that it was legitimized the Iraqi cultural, helping to create an unstable foundation for future Iraqi government. The next example I would like to tell you is about the incorporation of the armed militias into the army. Iraq had an army. It was dissolved after 2003. Then there were militias created in Iraq, principally by Iran, Badr, Da'wah, and various other organizations. Then the Iraqi army collapsed before the ISIS, and Sistani called for the Iraqi people to support the army. That created something which is called the Popular Mobilization Front. But this is a group of militias. And this is contrary to the Iraqi constitution, which says there shall be no armed forces outside the armed forces. It is totally sectarian by their practice, by their vision, by their, and there are umpteen examples from the slogans, from the way they operate, from the actions they've taken in Diyala and Samarra and Tikrit and Fallujah and Ramadi and various other places. The situation in these countries, in these cities, although it is sometimes referred to as liberation from ISIS, in fact, it was the destruction of cities whereby there are no people living anymore. And this is not the definition of liberation. Liberation, you keep something there and you make it usable. In this instance, we have destroyed the cities. So it's just like a plane full of passengers, and there is a hijacker on board, and you shoot the airplane. So you say you got rid of the hijacker. There is a third example which I would like to give you. I'm sorry for the interruption, so I have to jump things. Iraq has hanged more people than any country in the world per capita. It is the third on the list. Number one is China. And China, I don't know, the population of China is something like 100 times the population of Iraq. And then country number two is Iran, which is 3 times the population of Iraq. And number 3 is Iraq. So Iraq has hanged more people than any other country in the world per capita. In the constitution and in the law in Iraq, it says you sentence people to death, it will not be implemented until the head of the state, the king, the president, whoever ratifies it. That is what the constitution in Iraq says. Because of the great injustice that is being done, there is the Terror Act, there is Article 4, everybody is accused of all sorts of things, there are torture, there are admissions, there are secret informers, all the rest of it. Iraqi trials and the judiciary does not meet any of the standards that is acceptable to the world. Yet, there are people who are sentenced to death. Many of the presidents in Iraq who were brought in by the Americans feel it's heavy on their conscience to ratify these judgments because they know that these are unjust. Now, the government has amended the law, that's the law of criminal procedures, in which that it gives the president, and I assure you it's contrary to the constitution of Iraq, it gives the president 30 days. Either he signs or they execute. Regardless, this is an example of how you abuse the legislative system. I'm trying to get into the point where the government that exists in Iraq is not complying with its obligation under its law or under international law. And it is incumbent and it is the duty of the United Nations, the Human Rights Council, and indeed all the other countries to put pressure on this government that human rights must be respected, that discrimination must stop, that the ordinary rights of people should be respected. We hope that one of these days, the pressure, the international pressure on the government in Iraq will yield to that effect, because this is a duty on the international community. Thank you very much.
No, monsieur, please have a seat. Excuse me, have a seat, please. That's not time for questions, please. Please sit. Please leave with the audience. Gentlemen, please. Sabah made a very nice presentation about international human rights provisions and the abuse of legislation and ethno-sectarian division in Iraq. I would like to apologize for this disruption, and I would like to request if anyone would like to speak loudly, you can use any other location but this. Please, if you have a question, there will be a place to speak and ask the question after our distinguished discussants. Now, the last speaker is Paolo Casassa. He was a member of the European Parliament from 1999 to 2009, and he was also the chair of the Delegation of Relations with NATO Parliamentary Assembly. He is a lecturer in several universities and wrote a number of books on economics and international politics. Please, Paolo.
Dear Chairwoman, thank you very much for the floor. Thank you very much for the Geneva International Center for Justice for inviting me. I think that we just had a practical demonstration of why this issue is so important. We just saw what is the concept of democracy that the theocracy from Tehran wants to impose in the region and in all over the world. It's very simple. No one but themselves, they are authorized to speak. This is a disgrace, what we have seen, and I would like to give my full solidarity to the colleague that is next to me, whom I do not know personally, but whom I do believe is absolutely entitled to express his views. This is the principle of democracy. The principle of democracy is to allow whoever does not share your points of view to allow him to speak. And what we just witnessed is a demonstration of intolerance that can never be allowed. And I'm very thankful for the security services of the United Nations here present. I am very thankful to all of you to have overcome the present situation. And I would like to tell you that, I did write a book on most of the issues that we are now discussing. It was already written in 2008. It was called The Hidden Invasion of Iraq, and it was exactly on the issue of exporting of terrorism. And this book was to a large extent autobiographic and related a situation, what I saw from the April the 5th, 2004, when for the very first time I put my foot in, actually in an Arab country. It was not Iraq, it was Jordan, it was Amman, and from Amman I got to Iraq, and then I was there a lot of times. And I would just like to tell you that when I first got into Iraq, I thought we could be witnessing, in spite of everything, the beginning of democracy. I did believe that. I believed in a lot, not in all, but in some of the things that were the war on terror. And I saw with my eyes. I actually got lost in Iraq, this very first time, and I got into a very adventurous situations that are described in this book that is actually out of print. That's why I'm preparing another one, which is much more conceptual. I want to go on the concept of terrorism, because the problem is the West does not understand what terrorism is. Because if it would ever understand what terrorism is, it would have never have the policy that it is doing in Iraq or elsewhere in the region. Because what I have seen in Iraq, what I have witnessed, what I have interviewed of what was done by the terrorist groups financed, organized, armed by Tehran in Iraq is out of this world. It's the worst kind of terrorism that one can imagine. And so I would like to say to you that I have been several times in Iraq. I was in the south of Iraq. I was in the north of Iraq. I was mostly in the Ashraf camp of the People's Mujahideen of Iran. And I cannot stop myself from making here a brief going through to say how grateful I am that all the members of the PMOI are now safe in liberty, that they are out of Iraq, that they are saved, and I am very, very happy for this. And I learned, most of what I learned was actually there, and perhaps my best teacher was Hussein Madani. Hussein Madani is difficult to describe as an intellectual stature, and one of the things he told me when we met the last time was you know that, Paulo, I have been through the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and I would never imagine that I would be going through a second Islamic Revolution as I did the one of Iraq. And the difference between the Islamic Revolution of Iraq and the one of Iran is that the one of Iraq is much more brutal, even, than the Iranian was. And this was perhaps what I kept from what he told me that impressed me the most. Hossein Madani was assassinated in 2013, in the night of 31 of August to the September the 1st. He was not the first nor the last of the so many, many, many people I met and I knew and I got friend of that was murdered in Iraq. Just another one that I'm remembering, it was Mohammed, one of the Iraqi parliamentarian that I met here in Geneva, you know, in front of ACNUR and in Brussels, and he was murdered inside the Iraqi parliament. Inside the Iraqi parliament. And as it was said before, it was, you know, the Zawahiri, you know, the Al-Qaeda number 2 at the time, he gladly said, oh, we organized the attack. But not at all true. This was organized by the Iranian regime. And the fact that Al-Qaeda was ready to say, we did it, it's only another of the many, many proofs of the close cooperation between Al-Qaeda and the theocracy. And I would invite you, all of you who want to know where the truth is. I mean, go to a book who is authored from someone I never met personally, Jean-Marc Brizard. And he wrote the book in 2005, and it's called Al-Zarqawi, The New Face of Al-Qaeda. Read this book. I mean, most of it, more than half of this book, is on the biography of Zarqawi. And now is not very interesting anymore because, as you know, he was killed in 2006, in the beginning of 2006, in a place which, by the way, I know very well, Hib, which is an oasis in the entrance of the city of Al-Khalis to the north of Baghdad. And this book is absolutely fabulous because it describes with details all the steps that led to the creation of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It was created as such in 2004, but actually the first organization, Jund al-Islam, was created on September the 1st, 2001, in obvious connection with September 11, as a joint partnership between bin Laden and the theocracy in Iran. And the details are there. Even the press release that announced the creation of this organization was written in Farsi, was not even written in Arabic, was written in Farsi. We could not have a better way of understanding what's going on. But we are told that this is, ISIS appeared in 2014. Oh, well, it's like the Houthis that appeared in 2015. I mean, they have been there for 30 years, the Houthis. They have been there trained and armed and programmed to do what they are doing by the Iranian regime, by the very same regime that organized a Shia world army that is operating now everywhere. And it is operating, for instance, in Syria, where a very recent report shows that the combined forces of the so-called Shia army in Syria are much bigger than the official forces of the Assad regime. They are betting on the sectarian construct of the world. They are preparing to take over the Gulf. They are the biggest threat to peace, stability, and democracy. I would have never, and I did never, I have nothing to do with Saddam Hussein, and I don't have to say anything about him because this is something that just doesn't regard me. But I have to say very clearly that the theocracy demonstrated that there are terrible dictators as the Shah of Iran was, as Saddam Hussein was. But they happen to be much worse than this. And terrorism is only one of the several tools that they are using. And we have to be very, very vigilant, and we shall not allow that they will go on silencing, buying whoever they want, and imposing their will. In the memory of all those I knew and were murdered by the terrorist groups of the Iranian regime, and I did know many, many people. The civilians, and whoever wants to know, it's very simple. Go around the Iraqi refugee communities all over Europe. Go and interview them. Ask their stories. And don't tell me that they are lying, because a lie cannot be constructed by thousands of people spread all over the world. It's not possible. It's true. It's true. ISIS and the Iranian-sponsored Shia militias are the same thing. They are the worst type of enemies against humanity, and we have to combat them. And we have to do it with our fellow citizens of the Arab countries, with the Iraqis I know and I love the most, of course, and all the others. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paolo, for sharing your experience. And now we will switch to the commenting and questioning our speakers. And I would like to give the floor to our discussants. What they will do, they will speak 5 minutes each to comment what was said today by our speakers and maybe ask questions. And in 15 minutes, I'll pass the floor to the audience. Please focus on questions only. And on my left, it's Miss Elizabeth Nossing. She is the member of the Program on Migration on FORUS, a Swiss foreign policy think tank. Dirk, a little bit further, is a member of the Executive Committee of the Brussels Tribunal. And Miss Sigyn Mader, she will start. She is the member of the Iraqi Solidarity Association in Stockholm, in Sweden. Please, Sigyn.
Is it okay? Can you hear me? I will only talk about Iraq. The world knows about the bloody, horrendous crime of ISIL, whatever you will call them, but very little or nothing about the so-called popular mobilization, the pro-government, mostly Shia militias, which also commit heinous crimes, well described in the document we have got for today's session. Many of these militia are, as has been said, sponsored and directed from Iran in the name of war against terrorism. All crimes committed by this militia against the Iraqi people seem to be justified. The West, NATO, the international community accepts that all support is given to the corrupt, dysfunctional, and sectarian regime. You heard what Saba said in the Green Zone, and that this government integrates the militias, we have also heard about it, in the security forces, and also that they are still independent and have their own leaders. They are also terrorists and should be treated as such. The reason and the base for this situation is the US illegal criminal aggression and occupation of Iraq, and earlier the disasters of the Gulf War and the sanctions. A destruction, both social, cultural, and in all the aspects. I want to make a comment. The first speaker said that Khomeini toppled Saddam. You know, I'm sure that they want to export their revolution and all this, but the aggression, the occupation, and the U.S. installed a sectarian constitution. The U.S. fought against Saddam and toppled Saddam. So it's you have to look it in from also other aspects. And if I will say another comment from the speech, Iran out of UN, one of our speakers said, and then I must ask the speaker, shouldn't the US also be put out, if we start like that, put out of the United Nations, because they are the war criminals. They opened the doors wide open, not only for Iran and its increasing influence, I agree there, but for Saudi Arabia, Israel, Turkey, and others. And the US left a collapsed state and imposed sectarianism on this, and that is opening for division on this secular state. Will it be possible to solve the problems of the militias and others without justice, without accountability, and impunity for the responsibles of the Iraqi disaster? We have also to see the escalating military presence of the U.S. in Iraq. No time for that now. But I find it grotesque to see the U.S. war criminals in charge of the international bombing coalition. They kill civilians and contribute to the destruction of many cities, as Saba said, and they were destroyed even before by the U.S., these cities. When focusing on the militia crimes, we should also see the combination of U.S. bombing, helping the military actions of the militias. When Ramadi, Tikrit, Fallujah, etc. were so-called liberated, the bombings helped the entrance also of the militias into the cities and their crime. This, I think, should be discussed. And this, you can call it some sort of collaboration here between the US and Iran. And there is much to fear for Mosul, and at least 1 million refugees are foreseen to come. Well, time is limited, so I will say the following, that no foreign intervention into Iraq, both Iran, the US coalition, and all the others should leave the country. And I will finish before a few questions with a slogan on many Iraqi demonstrations. We are not Shia, we are not Sunni, we are Iraqis. And this is a little bit hopeful. And then I have the first question, if it's not going away. Why have not the concerned US bodies acted to put an end to the brutal attacks and killings perpetrated by the militias against civilians? And also, Saba gave us more details about the judicial system lacking in any basic possibility to justice, in spite of some pressure from UN, EU, and it's worsening. Of course, we have to pressure for investigations on the militia crimes and all abuses in Iraq. But do you think it could be possible to change the sectarian regime, this corrupt regime? Or should the international community try to help Iraq to have an independent, non-sectarian government which could deal with both the militias and other problems in the interests of all Iraqis from different religious and ethnic groups? I have more questions, but it's later, yeah. Time is up. Pardon?
Yeah. Oh.
Would you like to answer to the questions posed right now, or we can continue? We'll continue.
The Brussels Tribunal, I think, has a slightly different view. we consider the original sin and everything that derives of it, the American invasion, and I mean not since 2003, but let's say the mingling since 1980 with the Iran-Iraq war. There are some things that seem to be forgotten. Stratfor, I will read a sentence from Stratfor about what the American strategy is for the region. Stratfor says, these are the neoliberal and the American think tanks that comment about the situations, not only in the Middle East region, but everywhere. It says, and this is the title of that article was, The Virtue of Subtlety and a US Strategy Against Islamic State. It says, the American strategy is fixed. Allow powers in the region to compete and balance against each other. When that fails, intervene with as little force and risk as possible. For example, the conflict between Iran and Iraq canceled out two rising powers until the war ended. Then Iraq invaded Kuwait and threatened to overturn the balance of power in the region. The result was Desert Storm. So what do we conclude from that? And what can we extrapolate from it to the current situation? It is that the United States are supporting every side in the conflict against each other to weaken everyone. And I think that is the most important thing. We can talk about Iran, and of course, our position has always been we are against the mingling of imperial powers, and we are against the mingling of regional powers. We have been accused of being sectarian because we said that. But it is a normal principle in international law that self-determination depends on the will of the people, not the will of Iran or Israel, of the United States or Saudi Arabia or Turkey. It depends on the Iraqi people. So we agree on the criticisms that have been given to Iran, but we don't consider them as the main enemy. We must also not forget that the ones who created some of the death squads, like the Scorpions Brigade, were Sunni generals, not Shia, were not Iranian. So you had the Badr brigades, and you had these militias that were supported by Iran, and you had the militias that were created by the occupiers. And when people who organized the dirty wars in Middle and Latin America were transported to Iraq to reorganize the special police commandos and the national police, they incorporated the Badr brigades and the Mahdi army and all the other militias. And what is more, there were articles, I still have them, but they're no longer on the military website of the US. They were all interlinked. They had links between all the different companies, and so don't tell me that the Americans didn't know anything and that they were not guilty of sectarianism, while they are the ones who created it. I will give you an article of the New York Times of 8 April 2004, prior to the first siege of Fallujah. And there's one Shia who says, Sunni Shia, that doesn't matter anymore. Those were artificial distinctions. The people of Fallujah are starving. They are Iraqis and they need our help. And another one, a teacher, said, we have orders from our leader to fight as one. And he was a foot soldier in the Mahdi army. This was before the first Fallujah onslaught. We want to increase the fighting, increase the killing, and drive the Americans out. To do this, we must combine forces. But then in the same article, There is the comment of the American General Ricardo Sanchez. And he says, now that the resistance is heating up, spreading from town to town, the Sunnis and Shiites are drawing together. So American military leaders say they have been watching closely. The danger is, we believe, there is a linkage that may be occurring at the very lowest levels between the Sunni and Shia. And he said, we have to work very hard to ensure that it remains at the tactical level, and he also said the call for unity is clearly an attempt to take advantage of the situation. What happened in Iraq was that the national identity was being destroyed. The collective memory was being destroyed by the burning of the library, the driving out and killing academics and intellectuals, a campaign that we started, by the way, in 2005. So I do not understand, and this is a question I raised, I do not understand why the main issue is now Iran. We know Iran is dangerous, we know. But the main subject is still the United States. They still have, in every ministry they have advisors. They still have. So, and we believe it is important to support the civil society of the country of Iraq, who are still demonstrating weekly. And the slogans they say is, no to Israel, no to the United States, no to Iran. And they are for a unified Iraq. This is what we want. This is what we achieve. We support everyone that has been involved in patriotic acts and in resistance against the current occupation. As the resistance said, was the second phase of the occupation. And we're still witnessing the second phase of the occupation. But it's still an occupation. If today an American general says, I think the Iraqi army is ready to liberate Mosul, what does that mean to you? An American general says, we think the Iraqi army is ready. I mean, it's clear that the Americans are still in place and are still in force. And I want to close my short intervention with what Arundhati Roy said, the writer. She said, weapons were produced to wage wars. Now wars are being created to produce weapons. And we know the American economy is a war economy, and it cannot without war. So we will see chaos everywhere, and we will see groups fighting among themselves everywhere. And we would call for unity, unity against the imperial powers, unity against Sunni Shia. Let the Iraqi identity prevail over the backward religious identity that we see now, or ethnic identities. I thank you very much.
Okay, I would like to thank my fourth speaker, Mr. Dirk Adriaansen, very much for his words. And I thank you for being invited. I'm a member of Voorhaus, a Swiss think tank for foreign policy, and I'm a scholar in the Middle Eastern sciences and social anthropology, so I'm particularly interested in the kinship networks in the concept of forced migration. And hence, I will not go into political debates, but I would rather like to broaden up the discussion and give a number of sociological thoughts on the reproduction of sectarianism and militia rule. So currently I'm doing field research in Berlin with Syrian refugees mostly, and my main field of research are asylum centers, which are packed with refugees from mostly Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. I will take the Syrian realities on the ground as a starting point for my thoughts now. In this perspective, I will consider terrorism on the basis of its core meaning, spreading fear, irrespective of whether this definition applies to a state actor or non-state actor, local or international actors. Although the term terrorism is generally applied to non-state actors, the operating of state actors may be hard to distinguish from the operating of militias, and state actors may show a high degree of intermingling and interdependence with militias. We have seen this. This is also true for the Syrian regime, which has been heavily relying on militias itself, arbitrarily arrested, detained, tortured, and killed thousands of its citizens in secret prisons, and allowed allied militias raids and robbery against civilians as a reward for their loyalty. In rebel-held areas, on the other side, people fear persecution on sectarian grounds. They flee from so-called Islamic lifestyle imposed on them by the Takfiri militias, extortion, as well as extremely dire life conditions and the regime's air bombing and advances on the ground. At the same time, the different sections of the Free Syrian Army have nearly totally disappeared, while militias with distinctive sectarian features enjoy a very generous foreign sponsoring. Today, the MENA region is the world's highest ratio of refugees compared to the total population, amounting in all to 19.5 million internal and international forced migrants. In recent years, we have seen that there were about 2 million Iraqis and now 4 million Syrians who have forced to leave their countries. These refugee flows, I want to suggest, are the outcome of the rule of militias and have devastated not only the political and economical, but also the social fabric of the society, and produced notably millions of orphans. At the time of the withdrawal of the American troop, the UN estimated 4.5 million orphans in Iraq, around 600,000 of them living in the streets. Now, for Syria, we do not yet have UN numbers, but ISS, a Turkish NGO, estimates 600,000 children have been orphaned due to the Syrian crisis. In Iraq, like Beijing, orphans have become part of the townscape. In many cities on the countryside, they are serving in the houses of wealthy families or working on farms. The more lucky ones live with members of their extended families, but even in those cases, they mostly have to provide for their living on their own and can hardly attend school. Now, with regards to Syrian refugees in the neighboring countries, Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon, which feature Islamic family law and thus adhere to the principle of nasab, the patrilineal descent, many children cannot be registered because the father is absent or the parents lack necessary marriage documentation. Hence, apart from the impossibility to transmit the Syrian nationality, this also means that these children do not qualify as refugees and are hence not eligible for necessary assistance or schooling. When we look at Iraq, we see that orphans have become an integral element to the militia economy. They are abducted and exploited for human trafficking and human organs trading or trained as fighters. For Syria, some incidents of children fighting with militias are reported, different militias, and it is known that ISIS has special training camps for children, notably since they struggle with growing numbers of deserters. Now, my main point will be that the rule of militias is hence, on the one hand, to be seen as the root cause for the explosion of forced migration and orphans in the region, and is, on the other hand, nourished and reproduced by the vulnerability the rule of militias afflicted to the population.
Thank you very much to our discussants for highlighting different aspects of this issue. And now I would like to give the floor to our speakers to answer the questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, I was the chief of the human rights office of UNAMI in Iraq, and I could give you facts that I observed on the ground. The prisons in Iraq, 85% of those prisons were inhabited by young Sunni prisoners. Most of them have spent up to 5 years without any charges or judgment. Those people were kept in those prisons, and I cite exactly Taji. Prison of Taji hosted 12,000 youngsters between 18 and 25. Can you imagine the effect of putting together 12,000 youngsters who had not committed any serious crime because they haven't been charged or judged? They go at the age of 18, they come out at the age 25, they lost their education, they lost their life. What is left for their career? So to say that prisons were absolutely run on a sectarian basis, those Shi'i who were in prisons, the 15%, those ones were held for common crimes, for normal common crimes, not terrorist or political crimes. A question was raised why Iran is invoked in this. Yes, this is a good question. Of course, the real root cause of terrorism in the region today is due to the interference of the Iranian regime in the region, and I would probably mention the site of the Geneva International Center for Justice. They mention more than 82 Shia terrorist groups trained and armed in Iraq. So this is why it's important that we point to the source of the problem. And the source of a problem is Iran, whether we accept it or not, it's there, it's facts. Now, I would like to add another element. Who are the decision makers in Iraq? As an observer on the ground, I tell you 2 embassies run Iraq. The first embassy is the embassy of Iran. Second embassy is the embassy of the United States of America. The 2 embassies are the real decision makers in Iraq from 2004 till today. So this is why it's important to underline the role of these 2 countries in the rise of terrorism in the region. And I leave the room for my colleagues to answer the other question.
Thank you. I think I will address only one issue. What can the international community do? We don't want another invasion of Iraq. We don't want foreign forces to go into Iraq. We don't want the outside world to try and run Iraq for the Iraqis. But what the international community can do, and this is within their ability and their obligation, is to deal with the government in Baghdad according to what the international rules require. Therefore, they should bring pressure to bear that this government should change its systems, change its attitudes, stop the corruption, all the abuses should be reduced. The Human Rights Council should be a little more forthright in its condemnation. So far, the Human Rights Council, under the influence of the Western countries, they believe that there is no problem in Iraq except Daesh. And if you concentrate all the effort on ISIS and Daesh, and this is not an accusation out of thin air, but we've seen the reports that the delegation that went from the Human Rights Council to Iraq, they went principally to Erbil. They interviewed people who are victims of Daesh, quite rightly so, but they said that they could not interview the victims of the militias, despite the fact that all of them were in the northern part in Kurdistan, which is safe for them to do so. So we need the international community to put pressure so that it gets the country to begin to behave in a way that is acceptable, rather than concentrating on how much export we can send to Iraq, whether it's weapons or industry or other facilities in economy. And thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I think that on the first issue, I wouldn't say anything else than Mr. Boumediene already said. I mean, it's only a matter of knowing the place, not having ideological binds, and to see who is the cause of the mayhem. And I think that whoever does that cannot get to any different conclusion from what has been presented before. I would like to really congratulate Mrs. Nossing for her work, because that's the very first time I am listening to field work on refugees from Iraq and Syria, and this should be really continued. And I did it myself. I did this field work, but I did not make a statistical work that can be used in scientific terms. But I did go in Germany, exactly, in refugee camps in Munich, around Munich, because if you do that, I am sure that other than what you just said on the crimes against the children, you will see much more. You will get the stories of why these people have to migrate, the terrible tortures, crimes, corruption, the prisons. Mr. Boumediene, I'm sure he knows much more about this than I do myself, but he did not mention it. But the loads of secret prisons of Iraq where people are imprisoned just for getting ransom. And this is done it's not an exception. It is done on a very large scale in Iraq. And other than this, the tremendous sorts of deprivations that happened, and actually when I did this work in 2000, the end of 2009, I mean, you just have to look at what are the refugees. I mean, what is the prevailing majority of the refugees? Of course, most of them are Sunnis, obviously. I mean, I have, obviously my dream is to have a country in Iraq, everywhere, without religious or ethnic divides, and everybody is respected by themselves. But I'm not blind to reality. Obviously, the vast majority of these people that have to run away from Iraq because of the most disgraceful terror acts are Sunni Arabs. This is absolutely clear. So I would just, if you allow me, Mrs. President, just a small remark saying that back in Brussels, I just heard one of the best experts on terrorism, Mrs. Martha Crenshaw, saying that the problem of combating terrorism, the number one was the lack of terrorist acts. I mean, by this, she obviously meant she's only thinking of the United States and the West. If we would follow Mrs. Nossing type of work, I'm sure that the picture of terrorism would become rather different. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have just a little bit time for questions. Questions only, please. We pick up several. Mr. here, Mr. and Miss, 3 questions, and maybe one more if you have time.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
Okay. أولا أشكر السادة المحاضرين والسادة المعقبين جدا على مداخلتهم الأكثر من رائعة، وأشعر بالأسف يعني على الفوضى التي حصلت، وعلى أيضا اللفظ العنصري الذي سمعناه وجه لأحد الحاضرين بأنه أسود، وهذا لفظ عنصري تحت قبة مجلس حقوق الإنسان، شيء محزن جدا لم أكن أتوقعه. دعوني أدخل في الموضوع. وأنا أتابع الحديث الذي تحدث به السادة عن التدخل الإيراني في العراق، وكيف أن هذا التدخل كان تدخل تدريجي. أتذكر ما حصل في بلادي في اليمن، كيف أن إيران شاركت في إيصال الفوضى في البلاد التي كانت تسير على مسار ديمقراطي سلمي بعد مؤتمر الحوار الوطني، وكيف أن الميليشيات المتطرفة الحوثية بعد أن دخلت صنعاء قامت بعزل كل من لا ينتمون للطائفة، وتعيين قيادة عسكرية وقيادة أمنية وقيادة المناطق الإدارية، وارتكبت الانتهاكات وجندت الأطفال وقصفت المساجد، وأيضا حاصرت كل المساجد بدعم من إيران التي للأسف ظلت مع حزب الله تدعم الحوثيين وصالح لتدمر اليمن. لم تقدم إيران لليمن حتى مساعدة إغاثية واحدة، قدمت الأسلحة، قدمت الدمار، قدمت الموت، بينما
gave destruction, weapons, death to Yemen. What really happened is a catastrophe by Iran in order to establish sectarian. The question is, how can we face what is happening in Yemen and in Iraq by the Irani interference? This is a very harmful interference. How can we combat the recruiting of children in these hostilities on the basis of what can be presented at the Human Rights Council? Yemenis have suffered a lot from the interference by Iran. They gave us only destruction and death. Even those who say that they are waging war on ISIS and Al-Qaeda, this is all fabrication. Not a single Qaeda member has been killed. Those who are killing are paid workers. Thank you. Mariam from the Arab Federation for Human Rights. It is true that we daily see the crimes by Iran. Where is the United Nations here? What role is the United Nations playing? Where is the Human Rights Council? Where is the international community? Why don't they hold Iran to task? Why is Iran not held accountable? Why is the role of Iran not exposed, and particularly its support to terrorism?
عيسى العربي من البحرين. أنا من البحرين.
My name is Isa Al-Arabi from Bahrain. Bahrain is a small country. Bahrain was an example of peace and security until Khomeini came with his heinous regime. It destroyed all our hopes and dreams to live in our country in peace and love and in harmony. Your question, please. My question is related to the crimes of the popular mobilization, the Hashd al-Shabi. These groups take many names. They exist in Iran, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Yemen. Everybody suffers from this crime, and these crimes are parented by one father, and this is the regime in Iran. When will there be a united international front to expose this regime? The gentleman, may I thank the speakers. Mr. Taher, as a previous member of the United Nations, has said many important things. I believe the United Nations should investigate the silence of certain employees from exposing the crimes that took place in Iraq. The question is, the United States of America, the Security Council classifies Quds as a terrorist organization. How does the coalition forces hit the Syrian people while at the same time they are fighting alongside this terrorist group, Quds? My second question: through my work as a jurist and an expert in international law, I know that ISIS is formed by Nour al-Maliki and Bashar al-Assad. How are we going to hold accountable these criminals who created ISIS and made it the tool to terrorize the whole world with the complicity of specific Western countries? ISIS is the other side of the Quds brigade, the terrorist brigade. Thank you.
And if we will have time, we will pick up more questions. I don't have enough time, sorry. Please go ahead.
Let me say, because most of the questions were directed towards the United Nations, let me say that the United Nations, the United Nations is formed of its member states. The United Nations presence in Iraq represents the views of its members. This is one thing. A second thing is that the reports of the United Nations that come out of Iraq are first submitted to the approval of the government concerned. So the credibility of these reports where nothing could be posted outside Iraq unless it's reviewed by the government concerned, its impact is very limited. But despite of that, I invite you to refer to the UNAMI reports of 2015, where it put forward 5 very serious crimes amounting to crimes against humanity committed by Daesh, which they refer to as a way of covering up for the acts of the government. Then, for the first time, the UNAMI reports refer to crimes against humanity committed by groups of Hajj Shabi. Now, these groups, or rather these reports, they mention extra-legal, summary, and arbitrary executions. For the United Nations to report with this language, it's unprecedented. Second, there are expulsions from the territories, particularly Diyala, Salahuddin, Al-Anbar, and Nainawa. They are people targeted in order to achieve demographic change. This is not my language, this is UNAMI's language. The other thing is that the property of these people, when they were sent out of the areas, their property is destroyed. All these elements are elements of crimes against humanity. The civil society now, if the governments are not in position to act and they represent their national interest and what is called raison d'etat, it's the civil society's responsibility to request from the United Nations to answer about these reports it's issuing from Baghdad, particularly UNAMI's report 2015-2016. Thank you.
I can echo what Mr. Boumidra has said about the reports that the UN is now fully aware, and it is documented by itself and others, the crimes that are being committed in Iraq. Why the UN is not acting upon it, I think everybody knows that the UN is the collective will of the powers. And the USA in particular, and the European countries, and the 33 coalition of the willing, because they've set up a regime in Baghdad. They don't want to admit it's a Frankenstein, so they are trying to hide behind other things. The states, these countries, do not want actually to face facts. This is their policy, and this is being translated through the United Nations, and I think here is where Boumidra's statement is absolutely important. That is the role of the NGOs, to put pressure both on their governments as well as on the UN Human Rights Council. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a reality that United Nations are more an equilibrium of powers than anything else. And I would certainly agree with it. I would just remind one of the predictions that I was reading from an author on terrorism that is actually, I think, perhaps one of the the most interesting one, Walter Laqueur. He wrote dozens of books, one of them on new terrorism in 1999. And at a certain stage, he's speaking about the Iran terrorist network, and he is predicting, well, but okay, when Iran will start expanding over the borders, I'm sure that the international community will not allow this, and will do something about it. As we know, Mr. Laqueur, who is a very, very good historian, but he is completely wrong. We just see it. And my view is that it's very simple, is that what Iran is doing in the region, in Iraq, in Syria, and in Yemen, it's certainly much worse than what was done by the Soviet Union in 1980. And it is incomprehensible why the international community does not react as it should by stopping the immediate invasion of neighboring countries by Iran, stopping this so-called Shia global army, stop the aggression, not giving them the floor in the New York Times, as I just saw, not allowing a government where the Minister of Justice that was caught in tapes planning the genocide, the massacre of tens of thousands of prisoners in Iran, he was caught and he admitted 30 years, nearly 30 years afterwards, and he says he did very good, and it is a very good thing to do. It's a bit like if we would have 30 years after the Second World War, Goering or a guy like that saying, oh yes, I put 5 million Jews in the ovens, and that was very good, and this guy was a member of a moderate government recognized by the international community. This is unthinkable, impossible, intolerable, and we have to do something to stop it as soon as possible.
Thank you very much to all of you. Before we finish, I guess we don't have much time. I would like to encourage you to join us tomorrow at the side event where we will have our Nobel Peace Prize winner, Tawakkul Karman, here. And I would like to thank you for joining us, and there are some sweets outside in the corridor. Thank you very much, and apologies for disruption. I can't believe we finished.